Victoria gave birth to 9 children. 9. And yet, the narrative persists. Victoria never worked as hard as he did. I've seen this argument play out 100 times, in comment sections, in history forums, in the quiet judgments we make when we decide whose portrait belongs on the wall. There are the Albert admirers, people who rightly point to his staggering accomplishments, the Great Exhibition, the university reforms, the museums that still stand today bearing his influence. And then there are the Victoria defenders, people who bristle at any suggestion that a woman who risked death 9 separate times somehow didn't pull her weight. Here's the thing. They're both right. And the fact that we've turned this into a competition says more about us than it does about either of them. This isn't a story about who worked harder. It's a story about a partnership where one person built institutions while the other risked dying in childbirth 9 times in an era when that wasn't a metaphor. It was a statistical reality. And understanding what that actually meant, what both of them actually faced, might finally let us admire both without guilt. Let's start with the part nobody wants to think about too carefully. Childbirth in the 1840s wasn't a medical event. It was a gamble with death conducted in your bedroom with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and physicians whose primary contribution was often to make things worse. The doctors of Victoria's era didn't wash their hands between patients. They didn't sterilize their instruments. Their unwashed hands carried infections from patient to patient. Their instruments were rarely sterilized, and their interventions frequently caused more harm than they prevented. During the 1850s alone, a single decade, approximately 31,000 women died giving birth in England and Wales. That's not a typo. 31,000. The maternal mortality ratio hovered around 47 deaths per 10,000 births, which might sound abstract until you realize what it meant in practice. Every time a Victorian woman discovered she was pregnant, she was facing odds roughly equivalent to playing Russian roulette with a 50-chamber revolver. Not certain death, but death close enough that every woman of childbearing age knew someone, a sister, a friend, a mother, who hadn't survived. And there were 4 main ways that death came calling. Medical historians called them the 4 horsemen of death for mothers: puerperal pyrexia, childbed fever, hemorrhage, convulsions, and illegal abortion. Of these, puerperal fever was perhaps the most dreaded. It didn't strike during labor. It struck afterward, 3 to 10 days after delivery, when the new mother might have finally allowed herself to believe she was safe. What began as a fever would rapidly escalate into a pelvic abscess, septicemia, or peritonitis, a cascade of infection that produced agony as the body essentially poisoned itself from within. There was no cure. There was no reliable treatment. Women who contracted childbed fever often died slowly, painfully, and with complete awareness of what was happening to them. This was the world Victoria entered when she married Albert on February 10, 1840. She was 18 years old. She'd already ruled Britain for nearly 3 years. She'd presided over ministers twice her age, signed papers of state, navigated the treacherous politics of Parliament. By any reasonable measure, she was one of the most powerful human beings on the planet. And the moment she said her wedding vows, she signed up for something no king before her had ever contemplated: the near certainty of repeated encounters with death itself. Not on a battlefield, not in political intrigue, in the birthing chamber. Within months of her wedding, Victoria was pregnant with her first child. And this is where the popular narrative starts to miss the point entirely. We imagine Queen Victoria as the maternal icon, the woman whose name defined an era of family values and domestic virtue. We imagine her embracing pregnancy with sentimental joy, grateful for her biological destiny. That's not what happened. Victoria's own writings from this period reveal a woman deeply conflicted about what she was experiencing. She described pregnancy as wretched. She called it the shadow side of life. She lamented her unhappy condition. These weren't the words of a woman who saw childbearing as her natural calling. These were the words of a queen who understood, with brutal clarity, that pregnancy came at an enormous personal cost, and that she had essentially no choice in the matter. She was nauseated. She was exhausted. She watched her body change in ways that made her political work more difficult. And she knew, with every passing week, that the ordeal of labor was approaching. An ordeal she would have to face without pain relief, without surgical backup, without any of the safety nets that modern women take for granted. The birth of Princess Victoria in November 1840 was brutal. Labor in that era was unmedicated, terrifying, and entirely dependent on whether your body cooperated with the demands being placed upon it. Hours of contractions, no epidural, no option for cesarean delivery if things went wrong, just the hope, the desperate, fervent hope that nature would do what it was supposed to do and that you'd survive the experience. Victoria survived, but she didn't get a male heir. She got a daughter, which meant she'd have to do this again. The dynasty required a prince. The succession demanded it. So she would return to that chamber over and over until the job was done. And here's what I want you to understand. This wasn't a one-time ordeal she put behind her. Between 1840 and 1857, 17 years, Victoria was pregnant 9 times. She gave birth to 9 children who survived infancy. Princess Victoria in 1840, Albert Edward in 1841, Alice in 1843, Alfred in 1844, Helena in 1846, Louise in 1848, Arthur in 1850, Leopold in 1853, Beatrice in 1857. 9 times she entered that chamber knowing she might not emerge alive. 9 times she endured labor without modern pain relief. 9 times she faced the weeks afterward knowing childbed fever could still claim her. And throughout all of this, throughout the pregnancies, the deliveries, the recoveries, she was expected to continue ruling the most powerful empire on earth. The psychological toll was enormous. Following the birth of her second child in 1841, Victoria reported experiencing hallucinations. She expressed fear that she was losing her mind, what we would now recognize as postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, conditions that weren't understood in her era and certainly weren't treated with any kind of seriousness. Victoria was expected to recover, to resume her duties, to appear in public looking serene and regal, even as her own mind was betraying her. But sure, she never worked as hard as Albert did. Let's talk about Albert. He arrived in England as a 20-year-old prince with no defined role, no official title beyond husband of the Queen, and no constitutional authority whatsoever. He was German in a deeply xenophobic country that viewed foreigners with suspicion and outright hostility. He was a man occupying a position that had traditionally been held by women, the spouse of a monarch, expected to remain decorative and silent while the real power resided elsewhere. Parliament made their feelings clear from the start. They refused to grant him the title of king consort. They reduced his proposed annual allowance, a deliberate humiliation. The British establishment treated him as a fortune hunter from a minor German duchy who had somehow charmed their queen into marriage. In their eyes, he was an accessory, a decoration. Certainly not someone who deserved a seat at the table where actual decisions were made. The position of a husband of a queen regnant is one of the most difficult, Albert wrote, and he was right. There was no playbook for what he was attempting to do, no precedent to follow. He was trying to carve out a meaningful role in a system that had never contemplated his existence. But Albert was not a man who accepted powerlessness. Where he couldn't claim authority, he would create it. Where doors were closed to him officially, he would open them through sheer persistence and demonstrated competence. It took years, a decade really. Brick by brick, meeting by meeting, memorandum by memorandum, he made himself indispensable. By 1850, he had transformed himself into something without constitutional precedent. In his own words, he had become the manager of her private affairs, sole confidential advisor in politics, and her permanent minister. Nobody had granted him that role. Nobody had formally recognized it. He had built it himself through 10 years of relentless effort, until Victoria couldn't imagine governing without him. And then he started building things that would last. His first major public act set the tone for everything that followed. In 1840, the same year as his wedding, Albert attended the world's first anti-slavery convention in London as his first official public duty. Think about that choice for a moment. The anti-slavery movement was controversial, politically charged, deemed too radical for the Queen herself to be openly associated with. And yet here was her new husband, freshly arrived from Germany, making his debut at precisely this event. It was a statement. Albert intended to use his platform for causes that mattered, regardless of whether they were politically convenient. In 1847, Albert was elected Chancellor of Cambridge University, and what he did next would reshape British education for generations. The curriculum at Cambridge had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. It was dominated by mathematics and classics, subjects considered appropriate for gentlemen, but increasingly irrelevant to a nation undergoing industrial revolution. Britain needed engineers, scientists, administrators capable of running an empire that spanned the globe. Cambridge was producing men who could translate Latin poetry. Albert campaigned to change this. He pushed, against considerable resistance from traditionalists, to expand the curriculum to include modern history and natural sciences. He won. Cambridge began producing the practical, technically skilled graduates that Britain's growing empire required. This wasn't symbolic reform. This was structural transformation that would shape how future generations of British leaders were educated. But his most visible achievement was still to come. The Great Exhibition of 1851 was an idea so audacious that most people assumed it would fail spectacularly. A massive international exhibition showcasing the industrial and cultural achievements of all nations. Housed in a purpose-built crystal palace constructed almost entirely of glass and iron. Nothing like it had ever been attempted on this scale. Critics predicted disaster. They warned the glass roof would collapse under its own weight. They predicted the crowds would turn violent. They called the whole enterprise a foreign prince's vanity project that would embarrass Britain on the world stage. Albert pressed forward anyway. He applied his considerable organizational skills to every aspect of planning. He negotiated with exhibitors. He oversaw construction timelines. He managed logistics that would have overwhelmed most people. And on May 1st, 1851, the Great Exhibition opened its doors. It was an overwhelming success. Over the course of its run, more than 6 million visitors passed through those glass walls. 6 million. In an era without automobiles or airplanes. That number represented roughly 1/3 of Britain's entire population. The exhibition generated a profit of £186,000, a staggering sum that Albert refused to see squandered on frivolities. Instead, he directed the proceeds toward the creation of cultural institutions that would serve the British public for centuries. The Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, all clustered in an area of South Kensington that came to be known as Albertopolis. In a single stroke, Albert had demonstrated that he wasn't merely the Queen's decorative consort. He was a visionary, capable of reshaping British culture itself. Now, here's what I want you to hold in your mind. While Albert was overseeing the construction of the Crystal Palace, Victoria was pregnant with her 7th child. While he was negotiating with exhibitors from dozens of nations, she was recovering from the birth of Prince Arthur. While he was directing profits toward the establishment of world-class museums, she was managing the early stages of yet another pregnancy. They were working in parallel, each carrying burdens the other couldn't share, each essential to the success of their joint enterprise. And this is where the "who worked harder" question reveals itself as fundamentally absurd. You cannot compare the labor of building institutions with the labor of creating human beings with your own body while risking death each time. These are different kinds of work, both exhausting, both essential, both demanding forms of endurance and commitment that most people never have to contemplate. Victoria couldn't have done what Albert did. She was too busy being pregnant, giving birth, recovering, being pregnant again. The cycle was relentless. Albert couldn't have done what Victoria did. The biological capacity for pregnancy doesn't care about your organizational skills or your vision for educational reform. They needed each other. That was the point. And the partnership went deeper than parallel labor. Victoria relied on Albert's political judgment, his organizational abilities, his willingness to serve as a buffer between herself and the more demanding aspects of governance. When difficult correspondence needed handling, Albert handled it. When tedious meetings needed attending, Albert attended them. When political crises required careful navigation, Albert was there, working through the night on documents and strategies, while Victoria managed what she could between pregnancies. Albert, meanwhile, relied on Victoria's constitutional authority, her social position, her willingness to support his initiatives, even when they faced political opposition. Without Victoria's backing, Albert was just a foreign prince with ideas. With her backing, he could reshape universities, organize exhibitions, and advocate for causes that mattered to him. They worked together on correspondence. They discussed policy. They raised their children according to a shared vision of what the royal family should represent to the nation. The image of them as competitors, one working harder than the other, one deserving more credit than the other, comes from our modern tendency to turn everything into a zero-sum game. It wasn't. Not for them. But I haven't told you yet about the thing that made Albert different from most men in his position. The thing that makes me genuinely admire him, separate from his organizational achievements and his institutional vision. Albert cared about people who couldn't help him, people with no power, no influence, no ability to advance his career or enhance his reputation. Specifically, the urban poor of London, living in conditions that would have shocked any visitor from abroad who wandered east of the glittering exhibition halls. London in the mid-19th century was a city of violent contrasts. The West End gleamed with wealth. The East End festered with poverty. Grand exhibitions celebrated human progress, while just a few miles away, families were crammed into airless rooms without sanitation, without clean water, without hope of escape. Cholera swept through these neighborhoods regularly, killing without discrimination. Children died before they learned to walk. The wretched slums in the shadow of the Queen weren't metaphorical, they were literal. You could stand at the gates of Buckingham Palace and, with a short walk, find yourself in conditions that would make a prison seem luxurious. Albert saw this, and unlike many men of his station, he didn't look away. He served as president of the Society for Improving the Condition of the Laboring Classes, not a ceremonial position, an active role. He attended meetings, he reviewed proposals, he lent his public profile, the considerable weight of being the Queen's husband, to causes that weren't glamorous and wouldn't generate personal gain. In an 1848 speech, at a time when revolutionary fervor was sweeping across Europe and Britain's own social order seemed increasingly fragile, Albert articulated why this mattered to him. I have been induced to preside at this meeting from a deep feeling of the importance of the subject which brings us together, and also from a conviction that my sympathy and interest for that class of our community who have most of the toil and fewest of the enjoyments of this world. Those weren't empty words designed to make him look good. They were a declaration of priorities from a man who understood that privilege carries obligations. And Albert found ways to make his advocacy visible, impossible to ignore. At the Great Exhibition itself, that triumph of industrial achievement and cultural display, he ensured that exhibition model dwellings were prominently featured. These were prototype housing units, designed to demonstrate what humane, affordable working-class housing could look like, if anyone bothered to build it. Visitors who came to marvel at the latest machinery and artistic treasures were confronted with something unexpected: a direct statement about what Britain owed its poorest citizens. A challenge. This is what progress looks like when it serves everyone, not just the wealthy few. Are we going to build it? The inclusion of those model dwellings transformed the Great Exhibition from a celebration of achievement into something more radical. A vision of a different society, one where the profits of industrial progress actually reached the people doing the hardest work for the smallest reward. This was Albert's contribution. Institutions that lasted, reforms that mattered, a willingness to use his position for something beyond personal advancement. And Victoria's contribution? 9 human beings, 9 future adults who would carry the dynasty forward, 9 gambles with death survived, all while managing an empire in the gaps between pregnancies. Different kinds of labor, both exhausting, both necessary, both worthy of respect. So why did Albert die at 42? That's the tragedy at the heart of this story. The king we never had, because he never got the chance to become what he might have been. Albert had been unwell for weeks, though he'd continued pushing through, unwilling to slow down, unable to imagine life without purpose. He'd been working relentlessly for over 2 decades, managing Victoria's affairs, advising on political crises, overseeing countless projects and initiatives. Then came typhoid fever, the disease that killed indiscriminately in an era before modern sanitation, before antibiotics, before anyone truly understood how it spread. Albert contracted it, though modern historians have speculated that he may have been suffering from additional conditions that went undiagnosed. He grew weaker. Victoria watched, helpless. The physicians did what they could, which wasn't much. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert died. He was 42 years old. He never saw the institutions he'd helped create reach their full potential. He never saw the cultural district in South Kensington become the treasure it is today. He never saw the educational reforms he'd championed transform British universities. He never saw Victoria grow into the empress she would become. And Victoria? Victoria entered a mourning so profound, it would last 40 years. Until the day she died, she wore black. She preserved Albert's rooms exactly as he'd left them. She had his clothes laid out each morning as if he might return at any moment. She treated his death not as something to recover from, but as a wound that would remain open forever. 40 years. 4 decades of grief for a man she'd loved, yes, but also for a partner she'd relied upon. Someone who had shared the burden of ruling with her when no one else could. The mourning itself tells you something about the partnership. Victoria didn't grieve like that because Albert had been a decorative accessory to her reign. She grieved like that because he had been essential. Because without him, the weight of ruling fell on her shoulders alone. Because the person who had handled the paperwork, managed the politics, offered counsel at 3 in the morning when the crisis seemed unsolvable, that person was gone. She would rule for another 40 years without him. She would navigate political crises, become an icon, attend to an empire that still demanded her attention. But she would do it in black, carrying his absence with her everywhere she went. And here's what I want to leave you with. The debate over who worked harder, Victoria or Albert, is the wrong question. It assumes that their contributions can be measured on the same scale, that 9 pregnancies in an era when childbirth killed thousands of women each year can be weighed against educational reforms and exhibitions and housing advocacy, that we have to choose a winner. We don't. They were a partnership. Different skills, different contributions, both essential. Albert built institutions that shaped British culture for centuries. Victoria built human beings with her own body while risking death each time, and then ruled an empire in between. Neither could have done what the other did. Neither tried to. They understood, in a way that we seem to have forgotten, that partnership means recognizing different kinds of strength rather than ranking them. Albert was the king we never had. Victoria was the queen who gave him 9 heirs while ruling the largest empire in human history. Both of those things are true. Both of those things are remarkable. And holding both in your mind at the same time isn't a contradiction. It's the whole story. Victoria wrote something after Albert's death that captures this better than I ever could. She described him as her all in all, the person without whom the throne itself seemed meaningless. She didn't claim he worked harder than she did. She didn't claim she worked harder than him. She said they had built something together that neither could have built alone. That's the truth the comment sections keep missing. That's the reconciliation both camps need to hear. You can admire Albert's institutional genius without diminishing Victoria's biological labor. You can recognize Victoria's survival of 9 life-threatening deliveries without erasing Albert's advocacy for the poor. You can honor the king we never had and the queen who gave him heirs without turning their partnership into a competition. Because that's what it was, a partnership. Different kinds of work performed in parallel, each person doing what only they could do. And when one of them died at 42, the other mourned for 40 years. If that's not evidence of partnership, I don't know what is. Subscribe for more stories like this.